Welcome to the Tobacco Online Policy Seminar TOPS. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Si Shang, a tobacco researcher at the Ohio State University. TOPS is organized by Justin White from the University of California, San Francisco, Catherine McLean from the George Mason University, Mike Pascal at the Georgia State University, and me. The seminar will be 1 hour with questions from the moderator and discussant. The audience may post questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from these questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable comments. Please keep the comments professional and related to the research being discussed. Comments that meet the seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they are not read aloud. Your comments are very much appreciated. This presentation is being video recorded and will be made available, along with presentation slides on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will turn the presentation over to today's moderator, Mike Pascal from Georgia State University, to introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Today, we continue our spring 2023 season with a single paper presentation by Revathy Suryanarayana entitled COVID and Smoking, Evidence from India. This presentation was selected via a competitive review process by submission through the TOPS website. Revathy Suryanarayana is a fifth-year PhD candidate in the Public Policy Department at the Jeb E. Brooks School of Public Policy, Cornell University. Her research primarily focuses on the fields of health and labor economics. Specifically, she studies the intergenerational effect of economic policies and events on children's health outcomes. She also works on research projects involving tobacco policies in the US and India. Our discussant today is Rong Hai, an assistant professor at the University of Miami Herbert Business School. Rong conducts research in labor economics, education, and health. She received a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania. Revathy Suryanarayana, thank you for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. I'm excited to present this work in progress titled COVID and Smoking in India. This is joint work with Don, Alan, and Hua here at Cornell University. Before I start, I would like to put the disclosure slide out for our funding sources. This work has been funded by the Foundation for Smoke-Free World. The content, selection, and presentation of facts, as well as any opinions expressed here, are the sole responsibility of the authors and under no circumstances shall be reflecting the positions of FSFW. We would also reiterate that FSFW had no role in the planning or execution of the study, data analysis, or publication of results. Presenter, myself, has received no tobacco-related funding in the past 10 years. So the main question here is about how smoking changed or how COVID has affected smoking in India. Before I go into that part of the paper, I'll give you a brief introduction about the smoking patterns in India. There are around 267 million tobacco users in the country, which makes it the second largest number of tobacco users in the world. And most of them use cigarettes and BDs are this specific kind of mini cigars that are quite popular in the country. But 75% of the individuals who use tobacco in the country prefer them to be smokeless tobacco or chewing tobacco, which causes direct health consequences for the individuals using them. And it's not surprising then that tobacco consumption accounts for more than 1.2 million deaths in the country, out of which around 350,000 deaths could be just attributed to smokeless tobacco consumption, which is basically use of chewing tobacco. It is also found that this is responsible for about 27% of all cancers in the country. So given that this is smoking is quite high, tobacco use is quite high in the country, the next obvious question is whether individuals would like to quit. And it sort of seems like from survey evidence that around half of tobacco users in India would actually like to quit using tobacco products, but they are unable to do so. Given that this is a big public health crisis in the country, the government of India has taken a number of regulations to sort of combat this crisis in the country, and this has been going on for some time. Since 1975, there has been a number of regulations as listed here that has aimed at regulating tobacco use and warning individuals about the issues associated with tobacco use in the country. And so one of them is that it prohibits advertisement. There is graphic and textual warnings on packages, which I think is still being introduced in a lot of countries across the world, but India has been having that for quite some time now. There is warnings for smoking and tobacco products in movies and television programs. Many states ban the sale of single cigarettes, which includes BDs that I was mentioning earlier, which is sort of like a mini cigar, and gutka, which is a form of chewing tobacco, which is quite popular in the country and quite harmful too. And other forms of smokeless tobacco are also banned by many states in the country. With respect to new products that has come up that that are in the market that's new, such as e-cigarettes and heated tobacco products, they are also prohibited. And in fact, the e-cigarette prohibition came based off of the E-Valley crisis that was happening in the US, and it came around the same time. India also banned the use of e-cigarettes, not the use, but the manufacture, import, export, sale, and distribution. But I would like to say here that even though these products are banned, and even though many states have banned various forms of tobacco products in the country, the ban is not implemented in the same way that we would like to or we would expect to. It's not a complete ban. Anecdotal evidence from a number of different sources suggests that people are still consuming these products in huge numbers. They are still selling these products in huge numbers, and it's not very difficult to access these products in the country. Because of which all these consumption remains high, and the use of smokeless tobacco products also remains high in the country. Now let's go to the next part of the project, which is bringing in the COVID dimension to it. Now, like every other place in the world, India was also hit by COVID in 2020. The first cases started coming up in January of 2020. I think it started ramping up a little bit in February, and in March, there were enough cases that governments, state governments and central governments started taking notice and regarded it as a public health crisis. I think March is about the time when everyone started thinking about COVID as a public health crisis. So in response to this, what happened was that on March 25th, 2020, there was a nationwide lockdown in the country. And this was very strictly enforced. All establishments, all shops, all services, schools, religious institutions, everything was shut down. And the only things that were open are essential grocery services. The second important part, which is important for our context, is that mobility was severely curtailed, which essentially means that you were not able to step out of their house. And this was very strictly enforced by having individuals, police officers on the street, making sure that there were no mobility and no individuals walking outside for reasons, for anything except essential reasons. So this continued on for a month. So basically starting March 25th to May 4th, there was a strict lockdown where all of these things were happening. You were not having access to the same set of goods and services that you would have had access to if COVID hadn't been there. Starting May 24, realizing that this might not be possible to be continued on, districts started opening up. And they opened up in a fashion which was a little, which made sense at the point, which is that they classified districts into 3 zones: green, orange, and red, depending on how severe COVID cases were there in these districts. So for example, red had the most number of COVID cases, and orange had the medium number of COVID cases, and green had the least number of COVID cases in the country. What happened was red districts continued having complete lockdown restrictions. They continued the same set of restrictions that were there in April of 2020. Green and orange districts, meanwhile, had relatively lax restrictions on mobility. So some things started opening up. They were able to move out more than they could have before. They were able to access some of the goods and services that they were not able to before. And so they were sort of experiencing this opening up of the economy after this 1 month complete lockdown, complete restriction. And there have been previous studies that have used this variation in district-wise lockdowns and have found that these districts that had severe restrictions continued on in May 2020 had on average 5.8 to 6.6% lower GDP than districts that opened up. So it sort of points towards how much economically, these bans were having an effect on those districts that continued this lockdown even after May 4th. And so this figure sort of shows you how the variation of these districts were across the country on these different lockdown containment zones. So the black borders indicate state borders. So there are about 29 states in India. And you can see that across each state too, there's ample variation in the number of districts that had green, red, and orange zones. And even though there is sort of a regional variation in how COVID was there in this half of the year. So for example, in the eastern part of the country, you could see that most of it were coming off of green districts. That was because there was not a lot of movement in these states, not a lot of movement of people or goods and services in these states. But if you look at the states on the western part, you can see that there's a good distribution of red, orange, and green zones across the states in these part of the country. So I get this figure from Bayer et al., where they look at the impact of this variation on economic activity and GDP growth. So this was one part of the COVID restriction in India. There were two more parts which would prove to be especially relevant for the context that we are talking about, which is smoking in India. So you have this complete lockdown happening between March 25th and May 4th. This was accompanied by government-issued notices across India warning individuals how smoking and COVID might interact. So if you look at the panel on the left-hand side, you can see government-issued notices about various smoking tobacco use patterns that could contribute actively to the spread of COVID infection in the country. So in the first figure in the left-hand side panel, you can see this notice saying spitting in public places is a public nuisance and spreads COVID-19 infection. This is especially coming off of the practice of using chewing tobacco, where one behavior associated with the use of chewing tobacco is the act of spitting. And we know how important, contact or hand-to-hand contact, mouth-to-mouth contact, was very important in the spread of COVID infection. We wanted to regulate that. We want to minimize that. So there were these messages that sort of points towards these behaviors that are especially harmful for COVID-19, and and at the same time asking individuals to sort of quit using these products in the country. So it's the right time to quit chewing tobacco and pan masala for a safer and better health. You also have government messages speaking about how smoking might be weakening your immunity because it's making lungs more vulnerable to infection and diseases. You also have messages about how the behaviors associated with smoking cigarettes or smoking BDs, which involves like touching, holding the cigarettes in the hand, which makes use of your hand, and putting it in your mouth, basically hand-to-mouth contact, which could also increase sort of your chances of getting infected by COVID. So all of these messages were coming up, sort of indicating that this might be a good time to stop using these products, because this is not really causing you one harm through the use of tobacco products, but it could also be contributing actively to your probability of getting COVID infected. The government also did one more thing, which was the ban of the sale of liquor, gutka. Gutka is a form of chewing tobacco, and tobacco products in April 2020. So, and again, I would like to caution against thinking of this ban as a complete ban, like how we think about prohibition. It wouldn't be it is almost always impossible to enforce such a ban in India because of the lax enforcement. Um, but there is this, but you can think of it as an extra layer of caution or extra layer of, forced reduction of individuals consuming tobacco products because of this ban. So what happened was between in these two periods where basically in March 2020 and April 2020, where individuals were experiencing this complete lockdown, their mobility is curtailed, their access to the services and goods were minimized. They have all these messages coming up from the government saying, yeah, you should probably stop smoking. And you have this ban also of tobacco products. What this created was a situation of forced reduction, at least among some users of tobacco products. And so what we want to do in this paper is to explore how this temporary ban on tobacco products affected tobacco spending in India. What we want to use, especially, is to use a district-wise containment policy between May and July 2020. So the district-wise variation that I just showed to you to evaluate how tobacco purchases were associated with opening up after a relatively restrictive lockdown. We also want to see, and this is, I think, where we could use the most help, if this, so we might see that, what we see is that after opening up in May 2020, districts that opened up experienced an increase in cigarette purchases compared to those that remained closed. This is kind of obvious, right? Like when you have a restrictive lockdown, you are opened up, you go back to the you go back to consuming the products you were consuming before. But the real question is, did this ban maybe reduce the quantity of cigarettes you were purchasing as before? So did it really impact your cigarette consumption to any extent because of this period of forced reduction in your tobacco consumption? So that's the second part of the paper that we're trying to answer, is we want to see if this temporary ban really affected tobacco purchases in the post-ban period. And what we, at least with preliminary findings, is that there were no long-run decreases in cigarette purchases after this restrictive lockdown. And so where we think about this paper contributing is twofold. One, we think about this paper as filling in the gap of looking at COVID policies and smoking. So a number of papers have looked at how the health impact of smoking on COVID transmission and severity. And in a systematic review, Almeida and Gomez observed that there was a general decrease in smoking behaviors during COVID. But essentially, what we are trying to do is there were a number of COVID policies that came up, and this has a huge global variation. The kind of policies that India enacted would be, say, completely different from what something like Italy enacted. So what we want to try here is to look at the impact of a certain COVID lockdown policy on smoking. And in a previous study on a sample of adults in Italy, they found mixed results. There were groups for which smoking behaviors decreased because of a lockdown in Italy, but then there were also groups among which smoking behaviors increased in Italy, and they attribute this potentially to the increased stress environment that must have been going on for them at the time of COVID. The second important part I think we are contributing is to study this effect of forced abstinence. So there are a number of environments in which once you are in there, you are forced to give up your smoking habits. And some of them include if you are in a smoke-free prison, if you are a pregnant woman, if you are hospitalized. These are situations where you are suddenly put in a situation of giving up smoking. So you're suddenly pushed to a situation of going cold turkey. And a number of studies have examined how, when individuals are in these situations where they have this period of giving up smoking, how does that impact, once they come out of this situation, how does that impact their smoking behaviors? And generally, on average, they find that, there isn't an impact on their smoking behaviors, or in other words, if when individuals come out of this situation, they immediately go back to the levels of tobacco use that they were experiencing before they came onto the situation. So in India, in this situation of 1 month where you have a forced lockdown, you have number of anti-smoking warnings being given to you, have a ban on tobacco products, at least for some households, this is sort of forcing them to reduce their tobacco consumption habits or even make it, drop it to the level of zero. And so this is a situation in which we can study this question. When you're forced into quitting, giving up some of these habits, how does that impact your later, your long run, or how does it impact your smoking habits once these restrictions are lifted? So how we study this is from using this data from the CMI, which is Center for Monitoring Indian Economy Consumer Pyramid Database. What this data gives us is monthly consumption expenditure for a sample set of households across India for a wide variety of consumer goods and services. And specifically for our question for tobacco products, what we have information is monthly cigarette expenditure in rupees, which is the official currency of India, monthly BD expenditure, and monthly expenditure on all tobacco products. One drawback is that what we would have liked to observe is monthly expenditure on smokeless tobacco products or chewing tobacco products, but unfortunately, that's something that they do not ask in their survey, so we cannot really observe that expenditure specifically, but we can sort of back out how much they might be spending on smokeless tobacco products, given that this is a huge share of tobacco product that individuals consume in the country. So we want to focus on households. So number of sample restrictions here, we focus on households reporting positive tobacco purchases anytime between 2019 and 2020. We exclude those houses that do not have any tobacco purchases for these time period. For our main analysis, which I will make clear in a moment, we focus on a very narrow time period between 2020 March and 2020 July. So what we are trying to think of here is basically this time period where they had a very restrictive lockdown, which is the pre-period where you can think of the levels for everybody in the country just reducing. And then in May, June, and July of 2020, districts are opening up based on how severe the COVID cases were. And so this allows us like a good identification of the effect of opening up on tobacco purchases. And for our long-term analysis, again, we look at the months of May to July 2017 to 2020. What we are really trying here is to see if the May to July of 2020 matches the levels of May to July for the previous 3 months where COVID wasn't there. Again, a big issue with doing anything during the time of COVID is that you have a number of different noises and number of different policies, number of different movements that does not allow for a clean identification of anything. So when I say a clean identification, I'm talking about a relatively clean one. And I by no means think that this is the perfect identification, but from what is given to us, I think this is good enough to observe the effect of opening up. And again, one other challenge that that prevents us from looking at COVID time period is the lack of good data. This is because when COVID hit, a number of data collection agencies across the globe found it difficult to sort of keep up with their survey taking processes, because now a lot of restrictions were imposed. You couldn't do survey in the same way as you could have done before. So one major question is, whatever we observed, was it a function of how the data was collected, or was it the function of COVID in itself, or was it the function of something else? So we tried to give a response to that question of how reliable the data was during the initial wave of COVID. The survey institution, what they did, at least until February of 2020, they were doing face-to-face interviews. They would go and talk to the individuals and ask them questions and get measures of purchases for everyone in the country. Not everyone in the country, but the sample households in the country. But what they did was, as soon as they realized that this was not possible, you cannot go out and you cannot talk to anybody, what they did was they changed from face-to-face interviews and replaced by telephonic interviews starting March 25th, so exactly at the time of the lockdown. But even with these procedural changes, there was field staffs were not able to contact all sample households, and the final response rate was only 1/3 of the original sample. Data checks do suggest that the quality of the 1/3 sample that they could finally get at were quite high, and that reporting were true. But we only include in this analysis those households that were observable during all waves of the survey. So whatever 2/3 of households that they couldn't survey during the months of COVID, which is basically March, April, May, we do not include that in our final analysis. So before I go on to the summary statistics, I think I can pause here.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I first will turn it over to our discussant, Ron, to see if she has any comments up to this point of the presentation. And others, feel free to add your questions to the Q&A, and I will try to ask those to the presenter after discussant comments.
Okay, first of all, thank you so much, Mike, for inviting me to serve as discussant. It is an honor. So this paper is a fascinating paper that provides unique insight on smoking quitting behavior. Because the author has already go over, Revathy has go over the paper, and there's a lot of background information. So I summarize it, the timeline background just here for us to just have a very quick summary. So in India, in March, there's a nationwide lockdown. And then after that, government issued various warnings about the smoking increased the COVID risk. And then in April 2020, there is a ban. The government bans the sales of liquor, gutka, and tobacco. And starting in May 2021, all the different restrictions are relaxed across district depending on the COVID severity. Okay, so when I first, this is very, as I said, it's a very fascinating paper. When I first started reading this paper, I started to think about what do we learn from this paper's results? So one of the quick look for me, I don't have very good data. I have to say that the authors have very good data, monthly data with geographic variations. I don't have very good data, but as a very interested reader, so I decided to check what is the pattern if I can look at just a quick look at the US data. So although US does not have explicit bans on tobacco consumption or sales during the COVID, however, there are two channels that are common between US and India and can be applied to many other countries. So what are the two channels? The first is the forced reduction of smoking due to unexpected sudden economic lockdown. And this is very interesting because many of the tobacco policies that if people can anticipate the policy, they would potentially kind of either switch to a different, we have to be worried about substitution effect. We need to worry about people stockpiling beforehand, but that would not be the case for this very sudden lockdown in March, because no one really, at the beginning of March, we don't see this coming. It suddenly hits the economy. We have a very large scale shutdown. All the shops are closed. You cannot go out to buy a cigarette. You cannot go out to buy anything that is, have a very substitutable drugs. So that's the first channel. Now the second channel is that, as Revathy has showed to us, that is a warning government had issued. Same thing in US. If we can still recall in the COVID times, we see those warnings and there's messages in social media talking about that smoking increase your risk of getting COVID. So what does that mean? It means that suddenly everyone realizing there's extra shock in terms of health knowledge or health concerns. I was a smoker. I understand, at some point my lungs get, I will get a potential there's a lung cancer concerns at older ages. But I mean, I may choose to continue with my smoking and maybe quit at some old ages. But with the COVID, smokers potentially are really, really concerned about this. And this is the renewed knowledge, I should not say renewed, additional extra knowledge, extra concern towards health. Okay, so these two channels I think are common across India, across US and some other, and as well as some other countries as well. So now the natural question is, can we see any interesting patterns regarding smoking expenditure in US? Well, I don't have a good data, as good data as the authors, but a simple check can show us some interesting patterns. It's interesting. So you can see in the table one, what I get is from the BLS news release on consumer expenditure in US. So what I'm reporting here, citing here is average annual expenditure on tobacco product and smoking supplies. Now you can see the average expenditure on tobacco in 2019, before COVID hits, it's $320. Those are all nominal values, unadjusted. I take it from the BLS website. Okay, in 2020, you see a slight reduction, on average $5 reduction. Now does not look very big because again the shutdown and the rebounds back is very fast in US as well. So you see it's a $315. Now 2021, interestingly, you see this much bigger bounce back in terms of expenditure. That's something I want to emphasize. This is expenditure. Okay, so when we talk about later, I will also discuss that. How do we think about expenditure versus consumption? But let's look at this. Expenditure in 2021 in the US, tobacco expenditure is $341, much higher actually than previous years. Of course, we have the concern about the inflation. We know that in 2021, the inflation has picked up in US. Now, if we're just looking at eyeballing the data, there is a drop in consumption. There is a drop in expenditure if we compare 2020 to 2019, and there is a large increase in expenditure on smoking between 2021 to 2020. Okay, so now I'm concerned about if the price changes. So a simple way to do this is that now I'm going to look at the percent of the total, the percent of annual expenditure on tobacco supplies as a fraction of the total expenditure. So now you can see a pretty uniform and numbers is 0.5%, 0.5%, 0.5%, all through the years. Okay, so that looks like kind of consistent as the Revathy already kind of previewed part of the result. People bounce back to their previous patterns. Now, something more interesting I want to discuss, perhaps to kind of provoke more thoughts along this dimension, is that, as I said, if I think about this COVID impact, I'm very interested from my own research experience. I'm very interested in this health knowledge perspective. Okay, so this is something I found from the BLS website as well. So what do we have? We have the changes in average annual expenditure by income between 2021 to 2020. For total expenditure, the first row is total expenditure. The second row is tobacco expenditure, total tobacco expenditure. Okay, so this is annual changes, year-to-year changes by income quintiles. Okay, so now you see something very interesting, at least to me. So hopefully you find it interesting as well. So you can see the lowest quintile. Now you can see, okay, first of all, you see the total expenditure, they have increased their total expenditure. Okay, potentially it's because of inflation. And now their tobacco expenditure, total expenditure, also increased by how much? In percentage term, by 19%. Okay. Now you start to go over the income quintiles. You know, you reach the second income quintile. You see that the increase in tobacco expenditure is about the 4.4%. Now third quintile is 5.6%. Fourth quintile is a bit large. Now something very interesting is about the highest quintile. You see a reduction in tobacco expenditure in absolute amount and also in percentages. Okay, so now if we compare the tobacco expenditures with the total expenditure for the highest quintile income category in the US, now you see that their total expenditure has increased for the top quintile and their tobacco expenditure has declined. This is something very, very interesting to me. This is really suggesting things like that when we talk about the quitting behavior, and also, including the initiation behavior of smoking, we all talk about, we know that there's health knowledge plays a role. And in fact, one of the authors of this paper on Cornell, he has an awesome paper, great paper, 1991 JPE, where he shows that the differences of smoking behavior by education is mainly a large portion of that is driven by the health knowledge. Now, I'm very very, very, motivated by that paper. That's why my research are looking at I'm looking at smoking and education. Now I'm looking at this pattern, the US pattern. Again, the data is not that good. I'm just really doing summary statistics and eyeballing the data pattern. It's not good, for sure. I don't have geographic variations. I don't have monthly variations, or I have annual comparisons. However, it is interesting, I think, with the awesome data that the authors have to explore the potential role of health knowledge and to just look at if you can check that the quitting behavior by across household with different education level or with different income level are different. It'll be very interesting. Okay, so I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting discussion comments. Let's continue, and I'm sure that there will be audience questions forthcoming as they see other parts of your presentation.
Okay. So this here just shows you the summary statistics for the 30,364 households for pre-COVID time. And what I would like to draw attention to is the total monthly expenditure on cigarettes, BDs, and all tobacco products that's in the last 3 rows. A pack of cigarettes costs anywhere between 120 and 340 rupees. So it's the amount here, which is monthly consumption of cigarettes, seems very, very low compared to what you would expect in the US or any other countries. It seems like they're not even consuming a pack of cigarettes a month. When you come down to BD expenditure, you can see that that's higher than how much they spend on cigarettes. And this would be like it, and the BD, a pack of BD costs anywhere between 5 and 25 rupees. And so they are consuming even larger number of BDs than cigarettes. When you come down to total monthly expenditure on all tobacco products, see that this is quite high. This is quite higher than the 2 amounts that was there. In fact, more than thrice of 4 times the number that's there for BDs, even though this number also includes the amount spent on BDs. So, and an average cost of a smokeless tobacco, something called a gutka or something, is very, very less. It comes to about 3 to 5 rupees. And so here itself, you can see the importance of this particular measure because it sort of tells you how much individuals are spending on smokeless tobacco and how popular the product is in this country. It is more popular than cigarettes, and it is more popular than BDs also, which is mini cigars, and which is kind of different than if you look at other countries. When you think about smoking, you think mostly about consuming cigarettes, but here this is the other smokeless form of tobacco products, which is more popular and more used. Total monthly expenditure is about 11,000 rupees, and this translates to about $150. This is, when you think about it, this is very, very low. Nobody lives on $150 in the US in a month, but the cost of living is very low in India, and this sort of reflects the social fabric of the country, where a majority of individuals are low to middle income individuals, and this is the monthly expenditure that they spend on goods and services in a month. So this sort of, again, tells you the COVID timeline in India that I was just mentioning before. You have this average monthly household expenditure in rupees on the y-axis, and you have the timeline on your x-axis. The national lockdown was on 2020 March. And you can see that the 2 months are actually April, which after that seems a huge reduction in the average monthly expenditure of about 2,000 rupees. And when you compare it to the mean household expenditure, this is a huge decrease in how much they are consuming, how much they are spending on goods and services in the months that immediately after the COVID lockdown. Again, I would like to say here that we only include households that are observable across this time period to look at this graph. So we are not including households that went out or households that were not counted or they were unable to reach for this for the purposes of the survey in this graph. So this is purely coming off of individuals' drop in consumption drop in consumption because of the lockdown. And the next question, obvious question that we want to see is, did tobacco consumption fall between March and April 2020? And so this plots the percentage of household spending greater than zero on tobacco products. And you can see that right about the time of the ban, the percent of household spending, greater than zero, which is a very severe restriction if you think about it on the spending on goods on tobacco products, because we are saying you shouldn't spend anything on tobacco products during these 2 months. It falls about 0.15 percentage points, only to rise back up after the times the restrictions slowly started opening up. So this sort of shows that there were individuals for which this ban was truly a ban. And there were also individuals, it also means that there were some households who were still spending a positive amount on tobacco purchases, which also says what I was just telling before, that when you think about a ban in India, it's not a complete ban, especially at this time of COVID, where the resources were largely a lot of resources were devoted to other purposes. Before I talk about the event study, I think I'll pause for one more bit for the discussion.
That sounds great. Dr. Hyde, did you have any comments on this stage of the presentation?
Yes, it's quick comments, but maybe after the author finished the slides, I guess.
Did you want to move forward a little bit further?
Yes, so when she finished the specification, and I can have a comment.
Okay, that's fine. Well, there's one audience question right now. So the audience question is: a large proportion of BD users are temporary workers, laborers in India. As a result of lockdown, these people lost their jobs and the capacity to buy even after the lockdown was lifted. The effect of this forced reduction in use may last longer. What are your thoughts on the effect of economic difficulties on tobacco consumption?
Now, that is a very important question, because a lot of migrant workers I know had also this difficulty of traveling back to their home state during the time of lockdown, which essentially meant that they did not have any economic opportunities, nor did they have any opportunity to actually buy cigarettes or increase their tobacco consumption. So one thing that I would like to say is that I don't think in this survey we capture those individuals. So I cannot say anything to that specific population, because individuals, so I think this survey only looks at individuals who stay put in their houses, who did not move. So I think that might be a big drawback, or that might be a big sample that we might be ignoring in this particular setting. But I do agree that there's a huge number of BD users that were economically affected by the COVID, and therefore had to cut back on a number of different goods that they were previously buying.
Okay, thank you for that. You can keep moving forward, and then we will save remaining comments and questions for the end of your presentation.
Okay. So what we're trying to do next is to do this event study for this very narrow time period between 2020 March and 2020 July. So it is not a typical event study in this. We don't have a lot of pre-period, nor do we have a lot of post-period. We are not able to observe a lot of things. But I think this time period gives us the most cleanest identification. I don't want to use that word, but cleanest way to sort of see if there is any effect on tobacco purchases after opening up of economies. And so on the left-hand side, you have monthly household expenditures on cigarette, BDs, and other tobacco products. We have dummy variables for indicating each period pre and post. And the specification we control for household fixed effects. We also have time fixed effects, which is year-month fixed effects. And standard errors are clustered at the state level. The event time corresponds to the opening up of restrictions in May 2020. So May 2020 would be 0. And the treated units are orange and green zone. So what essentially we are comparing against our red districts, which had continued lockdown even after May 2020. So what we find what we find here is that opening up of economies led to an increase in the purchases of cigarettes and BD. So even after this restrictive period of not smoking and no consumption of BDs, or rather reduced, let me not say no, zero consumption, but reduced consumption of cigarettes and BDs and other tobacco products, opening up those districts that where these restrictions were relaxed, saw an increase in cigarette consumption. We have slightly imprecise estimates for BDs, and so cannot say anything particularly to that. And we also find, when we look at all tobacco purchases, which basically is a measure of your total tobacco spending on that particular time period, we see that also we see an increase in those districts that slowly started relaxing their restrictions, and people were able to move around and purchase the goods and services that they were previously able to. What we do next is to estimate this in a difference in difference estimating equation, where we have two dummy variables that we are particularly interested in, beta 1 and beta 2. Beta 1 measures what happens to your cigarette purchases in orange zones, which was the medium level of restrictions after the opening up, so after May 2020. The beta 2 measures how does this impact purchases in cigarettes for green zones, which had the most relaxed restrictions post May 2020. Again, we have household fixed effects and time fixed effects. Standard errors are again clustered at the state level to account for any correlation of events or policies that are happening within the states. Mike, should I pause here for the discussion?
Let's continue through the end of your presentation, and then we'll do questions and comments at that point.
Okay. So what we find is that compared to the red districts or red zones, orange zones and green zones experienced increased cigarette purchasing, increased BD purchasing, and cigarette and overall increase in all tobacco product purchasing. And if you look at the coefficients, you can see that this sort of aligns with how much restrictions were in place. The orange coefficients are slightly lower than the coefficients compared for the green districts, which had even more relaxed restrictions applied to them after May 2020. And $60 on all cigarette and tobacco products accounts for about 12 packets of BDs or 12 packets of smokeless tobacco at least. And so this seems like an immediate jump in their tobacco purchases once these economies started opening up. We might be concerned that not all households had really reduced their tobacco consumption during the two time periods, which is March and April of 2020, and that we are just picking up, we are not picking up the right thing in the previous difference in difference. So for that, we focus on a very small group of individuals that did drop consumption to zero during the initial lockdown months of March and April. And so what we find is that for those individuals, the effects are stronger. So for those individuals who did drop their consumption to zero during the 2 months, we find that their tobacco consumption increased a lot more than average tobacco consumption that we found in the earlier table. So cigarette purchases for the green districts increased by 22 rupees, BD purchases by 11 rupees, which is equal to 2 packets of BDs, and total cigarette and other tobacco product increased by 68 rupees, which is again about 13 packs of BDs or smokeless tobacco product. I'll go over quickly on what we do here. Basically, what we try to do is to, with the help of the new data set by Noah Sad and Kalra, where they collected non-pharmaceutical interventions in 5 Indian states, what we try to do is to sort of do like a placebo test. What we wanted to say is that, these restrictions or these drops in tobacco purchases should basically come off of retail closures. Any other measure of closures, including school closures or temple closures, shouldn't really affect how much cigarettes are being purchased. So what we try to do is to we explore the impact of these retail closures, school closures, and temple closures on household tobacco expenditure. And this is sort of like a check on what we are already doing. So if our results are driven by something else, we should also see an effect when we look at only school closures or only temple closures. And so again, we use like a difference in difference model on a sample of districts that had either a retail closure or a combination of school and temple closure. So our hypothesis is that we should see this effect coming off of districts that opened up after a retail closure compared to school or temple closure. And so what we find is that when we look at retail closures, we find that cigarette, BD, and other tobacco products are decreasing, even though we have very imprecise estimates. So we cannot really speak to whether this is this is zero or whether we are seeing something. And when we look at the impact of religious or educational institution closures and tobacco expenditure, we kind of again see we have very imprecise estimates. But if you look at the signs, it is a negative on cigarettes, but a positive on BDs and other tobacco products. So it sort of seems like it might be the retail closures that really happened and that really reduced like tobacco product availability during the 2 months of March 25th to May 4th that really affected individuals that started using back tobacco products after the opening up of economy. So this is the last part, and I'll go over it very quickly. We find that opening up increases the purchase of cigarettes and other tobacco products compared to a pre-period that was very restrictive. Now, compared to the pre-periods before COVID, is this really an increase, or did something happen that made individuals on average reduce their tobacco consumption as before? So what we right now do is to run the DID specification with pre-periods defined as the months of May, June, and July, 2017 to 2019. So we take 3 years before where there were no COVID and the same 3 months that we are trying to examine later on too. What we find is that this did not really affect their average tobacco consumption after opening up compared to the 3 years and the 3 months that we are looking at in 2020. So what this essentially means is that individuals, when there was a restrictive lockdown and cigarette purchases increased after that, it went back to almost the same levels as there was when there was no COVID in the months of May, June, and July, 2017 to 2019. In fact, for some districts, we even see an increase in the total spending on cigarettes and other tobacco products after opening up compared to the 3 years before for the months of May, June, and July. Now, this is something where I think I could use the most help in sort of identifying is this the right way to check whether there was any average changes in cigarette purchases for those individuals, after the economy was opened up. But from our preliminary findings, we think that there was really no change. Individuals started spending almost the same amount on tobacco products as they were before COVID and before any of these restrictive lockdowns were happening. So I'll close here. We find that opening up after a very restrictive lockdown had a positive impact on cigarette and tobacco purchases in that it increased after opening up. Cigarette purchases bounces back to pre-COVID levels. At least that's what we find in this preliminary analysis after restrictive policies were lifted. A big caveat section because we are unable to distinguish the effect of COVID and the ban. This is happening at a time where everything was very weird. There was a lot of things happening at the same time. There was COVID, which was a very stressful period. So this makes us not able to generalize these findings to a setting where if you think there was a ban, if you think these restrictive things were happening, what would have happened in the absence of COVID is something that we are not able to answer at this point. We are also unable to simulate the environment of a complete ban. As the data shows, there might be still illegal purchases or ban may not have been completely enforced. So this is not, you shouldn't think of this ban or this temporary lockdown as something that was very 100% enforced. Is something that is very porous, and individuals had the opportunity sometimes to buy. So this paper is not about a complete ban too. So these are big things that I would like for you to keep in mind when you take away the results from the paper.
Okay, thank you so much for a very interesting presentation. We have only 4 minutes, so I'm going to turn it over to our discussion for a few minutes, and then we will take a few minutes for audience question and comments at the end.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me continue my discussion. One of my comments is that I'm concerned that the COVID restriction and the relaxation of the restrictions also affects the prices. Accidentally, it's very hard to know that suddenly relax the restriction. Would the price? How does the price change across district and also across a time period? Perhaps it's not a very big concern for a shorter time period, but what about across districts? Now, the second is also mentioned in one of the Q&A, which is the household income, and as a result, the total budget may be different because the dependent variable we are looking at is the expenditure. What if people's income, for sure, many people's income when they do not have a job to work for, so their income will be affected and total budget will be affected. Now, how do we think about once your total budget is affected? Now, the expenditure, how do we think about expenditure translating into the consumption of cigarettes? As a result, my suggestion is that perhaps it's interesting to check 2 additional outcome variables in order to alleviate these concerns. The first is to check the share of tobacco expenditure as the fraction of total expenditure. Okay, so that potentially could to some extent control for the price effect. Now, the second is to looking at only the participation, the smoking participation. I've seen that in your slides that you have analysis showing that the fraction of households with positive tobacco expenditure before and after, but I did not see that you have done such, using this as a dependent variable to run your regression analysis. So that's my additional analysis. I have a brief summarize of what finding is that short run effect, which is from March 2020 to July 2020, you see that there's an increase in tobacco expenditure. Now, the long run effect, what we see something very interesting is that in the long run, if compared to the pre-COVID period, everything bounced back. In fact, if you in your regression, I noticed that the total expenditure on tobacco is even higher than pre-COVID time. So that would really make me think that we should perhaps to check the 2 additional outcome variables, as well as even though we don't see impact from the long run perspective, okay, in terms of BDs and cigarette expenditure. However, potentially, I would still be interested to see, as I previously mentioned, that does the effect be different depending on the household heads' education levels or income levels. So I very much enjoy reading the paper. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Audience, feel free to add questions to the Q&A, and we'll try to cover them as many as we can. So here's a question from Kavita. BDs are tobacco products available or bought from very small stores. BD users, again, do not have fixed salaries. Please elaborate a little on data collection and limitations of the study because of the method of data collection, if any.
Yeah, so that is one concern that we have too, in the sense that one major change in the survey during COVID was that it shifted to telephone interviews from face-to-face. So if I can imagine a number of these BD users do not have telephones or do not have a reliable telephone through which the surveys individuals can reach them. And so I think in the final sample, we might be dropping a number of individuals who do not have, who might not have a reliable phone connection, and it might be indicators of, not having a definite income or not having consumption power to buy BDs. I think I really like the suggestion Rong Hai gave, which is to sort of look at look at how this differs across income categories and across employment categories, I think we can get at some of the question, some part of the question that you had by looking at these heterogeneity. I think if they are being affected a lot, I think we should pick up that in the heterogeneity when we look at it by income or by their employment.
Okay, thank you. A question from Adicon. Lower income would only make the fraction spent on tobacco higher, correct?
That's correct. I think so.
Okay. Okay, great. So I see that we are out of time, so I'm going to send it back to our MC to take us out the door.
Thank you both. We're out of time. Thank you to our presenter, moderator, and discussant. Finally, thank you to the audience of 122 people for your participation. Have a top-notch weekend. Bye-bye.